You're listening to the Archetype Effect, conversations redefining power, purpose and leadership for women and the coaches who guide them. I'm Ros Cardinal, leadership coach and creator of the Women's Leader Archetypes. Together we'll explore the real stories, the research and reflections that help women rise with clarity and authentic power. One of my favourite moments in coaching doesn't happen when someone has a breakthrough about themselves. It happens when they have a breakthrough about the system they're working in. They'll often stop mid-conversation, lean back in their chair and say, "Oh, now it makes sense." It's one of my favourite phrases to hear, because in that moment, nothing has actually changed. Their workplace hasn't changed. Their colleagues haven't changed. The decision they're frustrated by hasn't changed. What has changed is what they can see. They've stopped looking only at what's happening on the surface, and they've started to notice something underneath it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Welcome back to the Archetype Effect. I'm Ros Cardinal. This season we're exploring the hidden rules of work. Not so you can become more political, but so you can become more aware. Because awareness gives you choices. In our first episode, we challenged the idea that good work speaks for itself. In the second, we explored why influence often begins long before anyone walks into a meeting. Both of those conversations pointed to something bigger, something deeper. Today, I'd like to introduce an idea that I think explains why so many workplaces feel confusing. I want you to imagine standing beside a river. On the surface, everything seems obvious. You can see the water moving. You can follow its direction. You can watch it bend around rocks and trees as it continues downstream. But beneath the surface, there's another story. Underground streams feed the river long before the water reaches your feet. Tree roots spread through the soil, drawing nutrients from places you can't see. Fungi form vast underground networks connecting one tree to another, carrying water, nutrients and chemical signals across an entire forest. Scientists sometimes call it the wood wide web. The forest isn't sustained only by what's visible above the ground. Most of what keeps it alive is happening underneath it. Organisations are remarkably similar. Most of us spend our careers looking at what's above the surface. The organisational chart, the job titles, the meetings, the policies, the strategy documents, the formal reporting lines. They're all important, but they're only part of the picture. Underneath every organisation is another system. One that isn't written into induction manuals. One that rarely appears in leadership textbooks. It's made up of relationships, trust, history, reputation, shared experiences, old alliances, unspoken expectations, conversations that happen in corridors, over coffee, in the car park, or a quick phone call in between meetings. It's constantly moving, constantly adapting, constantly shaping what happens above the surface. I think of it as the underground river of an organisation. You can't always see it, but you can certainly see its effects. It explains why two people can present equally good ideas and receive completely different responses. Why one change initiative gathers momentum while another one quietly stalls. Why someone with very little formal authority can have enormous influence. And why, despite our best intentions, work sometimes feels far more complicated than we expected. If you've been listening since seasons 1 and 2, you'll know we've spent a lot of time exploring the landscape within ourselves, our archetypes, our patterns, our nervous systems, and how they shape the way we respond to the world. Those foundations still matter. In fact, they matter enormously. But today I'd like us to lift our eyes, because understanding yourself is only half the picture. The other half is learning to understand the ecosystem you're working within. Not just the organisation you can see, but the underground river flowing beneath it. And once you begin to notice that river, work starts making a whole lot more sense. Let me tell you 3 stories, not because they're unusual, quite the opposite. I've seen versions of these stories in government departments, universities, community organisations, corporate businesses, and family-owned companies. Different industries, different people, but the same patterns. The first story is about a promotion. A leader once said to me, "I just don't understand it." The person who'd been promoted wasn't the most experienced. They weren't the strongest technically. In fact, several people in the team quietly felt there were others who were better qualified. Almost immediately the stories began. They're playing favourites. It's all politics. They've overlooked the best person. Now, could that happen? Of course. Organisations aren't perfect. But as we explored the situation, another picture began to emerge. The person who'd been promoted has spent years building trust across the organisation. They'd worked with multiple departments. People knew how they responded under pressure. They'd earned a reputation for bringing people together when projects became difficult. When senior leaders looked at that promotion, they weren't simply assessing technical capability. They were asking a much bigger question. Who can bring people with them? The underground river was telling a different story. Here's another one. An organisation launched what looked like an excellent change initiative. The strategy was thoughtful, the planning was thorough, the communication was clear. And yet, nothing happened. People nodded in meetings, agreed with the direction, then quietly carried on doing exactly what they'd always done. The leadership team couldn't understand it. We've communicated this 3 times. We've explained the benefits. Why is everyone resisting? But when we spent time inside the organisation, something fascinating appeared. People weren't resisting the change. They were protecting relationships. The new processes disrupted informal ways of helping each other. It unintentionally weakened trusted connections that had developed over many years. From the surface, it looked like resistance. Underneath, it was the ecosystem trying to preserve itself. The underground river was telling a different story. And then there's a story I see over and over again. Someone without a particularly senior title becomes one of the most influential people in the organisation. Perhaps it's an executive assistant. Perhaps it's a project coordinator. Perhaps it's someone who's been there for 20 years. When something important happens, people naturally gravitate towards them. Not because they have authority, because they have perspective. They know the history. They understand the relationships. They know where previous attempts have succeeded and where they've quietly failed. They're trusted. And trust is one of the strongest currents in any organisational ecosystem. On paper, these 3 stories look completely different. A promotion, a change initiative, an influential employee. But underneath, the same river is flowing. Relationships, trust, history, credibility, connection. None of those things appear on the organisational chart, yet every one of them shapes how the organisation moves. That's why when we only look at what's happening above the surface, work can feel confusing. We're trying to explain visible outcomes without seeing the invisible forces that created them. So what exactly is this underground river? If it isn't job titles or reporting lines or formal authority, what are we actually looking at? I think of it as the ecology of an organisation. Just as every natural ecosystem is shaped by countless interactions between plants, animals, water, soil and climate, every organisation is shaped by the interactions between people. Some of these interactions are easy to see. Most are not. Take trust, for example. Trust isn't allocated by position, it's earned over time. It grows through hundreds of small moments. Keeping your word, following through, handling pressure well, listening, being fair, supporting others when things become difficult. Eventually people stop asking, can they do the job? They start asking, can I trust them? Trust changes how quickly ideas move, how openly people share information, how willing they are to take a risk together. It's one of the strongest currents in the underground river. Then there's history. Every organisation has a memory. Sometimes it's written down, often it isn't. People remember restructures that failed. They remember projects that consumed enormous energy but achieved very little. Leaders who promised one thing and delivered another. Teams that used to be in conflict. Successful collaborations that built lasting confidence. Even when no one talks about these experiences anymore, they continue shaping how people respond today. You might think you're presenting a brand new idea. Someone else is quietly remembering the last time the organisation tried something similar. History is still flowing beneath the surface. Then there are relationships. Relationships determine how quickly people pick up the phone, whether someone asks for your opinion before making a decision, whether difficult conversations happen early or after problems have already grown. Healthy relationships create healthy flow. When relationships become strained, information slows down. People become cautious. Silos begin to form. Energy gets trapped. That's true in nature, and it's true in organisations as well. Another current is credibility. Not competence, but credibility. Competence is about doing what you're capable of doing. Credibility is about what other people believe you're capable of doing. Those aren't always the same thing. And that's why visibility matters, not because we want to become self-promotional, but because people can only draw on what they know. If your work is invisible, your credibility has less opportunity to grow. Finally, there's something we rarely acknowledge. Meaning. Every person is trying to protect something. Their team's workload, a customer's experience, a professional reputation, a budget, a relationship, a deeply held value. When we understand what people are trying to protect, their behaviour often becomes much easier to understand. What looked like resistance may actually be responsibility. What looked like stubbornness may actually be caution. What looked like disengagement might actually be exhaustion. The underground river reminds us that behaviour never exists in isolation. It emerges from the conditions surrounding it. That's one of the most important ideas in ecology, and I believe it's one of the most important ideas in leadership as well. People don't exist separately from the systems they're part of. Neither do organisations. Everything influences everything else. Which means if we want to understand what's happening on the surface, we have to become curious about what's happening underneath. That's where the real learning begins. So, if organisations are living ecosystems, how does that change the way we lead? I think the first shift is this. We stop assuming and we start observing. It's one of the simplest changes we can make and one of the most powerful. When something doesn't go our way, our brain is remarkably quick to fill in the blanks. They don't value my contribution. They're blocking my idea. Leadership has already made up its mind. They're playing politics. Sometimes these stories are true, but often they're simply the first explanation our brain can find. One of the things I've learned over many years of coaching leaders is that behaviour almost always makes sense once you understand the conditions surrounding it. The challenge is that we rarely see all of those conditions. We see one conversation, not the 10 conversations that came before it. We see one decision, not the months of competing pressures that shaped it. We see one person's response, not the relationships, history, expectations and responsibilities they're carrying into that moment. The underground river reminds us to become curious before we become certain. Instead of asking, why are they doing this to me? Try asking, what else might be happening here? It's a small question, but it changes everything. Because curiosity opens possibilities. Judgment closes them. As coaches, we know this instinctively. We don't walk into a coaching conversation assuming we already know why someone behaves the way they do. We stay curious, we ask questions, we explore the wider context. Leadership deserves exactly the same discipline. The most effective leaders I've worked with aren't the ones who jump to conclusions the fastest. They're the ones who notice more. They notice patterns. They notice relationships. They notice who has influence without authority. They notice where energy is building and where it's draining away. They notice when a team has stopped trusting each other long before the performance numbers begin to fall. In ecology, if a river suddenly changed course, you don't blame the water. You become curious about the landscape. Has something blocked its path? Has the ground shifted? Has another stream joined it? The river is responding to its environment. People do exactly the same thing. When someone's behaviour changes, be curious. When a team becomes resistant, be curious. When communication suddenly dries up, be curious. When an idea struggles to gain traction, be curious. Not because curiosity guarantees the right answer, but because it gives you a far better chance of finding the right question. And leadership, in my experience, has never really been about having all the answers. It's about learning to see what other people haven't noticed yet. That's what political intelligence really is. Not manipulating the ecosystem, understanding it, working with it, respecting that every action creates a ripple somewhere else in the system. Because once you start seeing organisations as living ecosystems, you stop trying to fight the river. You start learning how to read it. So here's your experiment for this week. For the next 5 working days, I don't want you to try to change anything. Don't try to become more influential. Don't try to persuade anyone. Don't worry about saying exactly the right thing. Just observe. Become a student of your organisation's ecosystem. As you move through your week, imagine you're standing beside that river we talked about earlier. You're not trying to redirect it. You're simply learning how it flows. Notice where trust seems to gather. Who do people naturally turn to when they need advice? Not because they have to, because they want to. Notice where information flows easily and where it slows down. Are there teams that naturally share ideas? Are there places where communication seems to stop? Notice where energy sits. Which conversations leave people energised? Which meetings seem to drain the room? Which projects seem to gather momentum almost effortlessly? And which ones always seem to struggle, no matter how good the idea is? Notice the people who connect others. Every organisation has them. The people who introduce colleagues who need to meet. The people who quietly resolve tensions before they become conflicts. The people who help ideas travel from one part of the organisation to another. They may never appear on an organisation chart as connectors, but every healthy ecosystem has them. Notice too what happens when something changes. When a new leader arrives, when a restructure is announced, when priorities shift. Where does the river speed up? Where does it become more cautious? Where does it find a new path? Don't judge what you see. Just notice it. You might even keep a few notes during the week, not about individuals, but about patterns. What surprised you? What challenged an assumption you'd been making? What suddenly made sense? Because here's what I think you'll discover. The more you observe, the less mysterious your organisation becomes. You'll begin to understand why some ideas flourish while others don't. Why some people become trusted so quickly. Why change sometimes feels effortless. And sometimes it feels like pushing against the current. You'll stop seeing isolated events and start seeing the connected patterns. That's the beginning of political intelligence. Not becoming more calculating, becoming more aware. Because awareness creates choice. And choice is where influence begins. Next week, we're going to build on today's conversation by exploring one of the most underrated leadership capabilities I know. Reading the room. Not just noticing who's speaking, but sensing the emotional climate beneath the conversation. Understanding what's being said and what isn't being said. And what the room is quietly telling you before anyone has reached a decision. Until then, I'd encourage you to download this episode's field guide. I've included some reflection questions and an observation activity to help you map your own organisational ecosystem. You'll find the link in the show notes. And I'd love to leave you with one final thought. The organisational chart tells you where people sit. The underground river tells you how the organisation moves. Learn to read both. Because when you understand the visible organisation and the invisible one, you stop feeling like you're fighting the current. You begin to understand where it's taking you. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Archetype Effect. I'll see you next time. Thanks for joining me on the Archetype Effect. If this episode sparked an insight, share it with a woman who leads, or leave a review so more women can find these conversations. Until next time, lead with purpose and power that feels like you.